Good morning, friends. We're on Chapter 2. The SS began their inspection of the hut with scarcely a glance at the prisoners, focusing their attention on the walls, the floor, and the surroundings. The Germans are systematic like that. First the container, then its contents. Dr. Mengele turns around to speak with Freddie Hirsch, who has remained standing almost at attention all this time. Dita wonders what they're talking about. Few Jews could hold a conversation with Mengele, or Dr. Death as he is called, with such assurance. Some say that Hirsch is a man without fear. Others believe the Germans warm to him because he is German. Some even suggest his impeccable appearance hides something unsavory. The priest, who is in charge of the inspection, makes a gesture Dita can't interpret. If the guards order them to stand to attention, how will she hold the books without them falling out? The first lesson any veteran inmate teaches a recent arrival is that you must always be clear about your goal, survival. To survive a few more hours and in this way gain another day that added to other days might become one more week. You must continue like this, never making big plans, never having big goals, only surviving each moment. To live is a verb that only makes sense in the present tense. It's her first chance to leave the books. There's an empty stool just a meter away. When they stand up to form lines and the guards find the books there, they won't be able to accuse her. All of them and none of them will be guilty. And they won't be able to take all of them to the gas chambers, though without a doubt they'll shut down Block 31. Dita wonders if it would really matter. She'd heard how some of the teachers initially questioned the school. Why make the children study when there's little chance they'll leave Auschwitz alive? Does it make any sense to talk to them about polar bears and drill them on multiplication tables, in the shadow of chimneys belching out the black smoke of burning bodies? But Hirsch convinced them. He told them that Block 31 would be an oasis for the children. Oasis or mirage, some of them still wonder. The most logical thing would be to get rid of the books, to fight for her life. But Dita hesitates. The sergeant stands to attention in front of his superior. When he hears the order, he shouts out, "On your feet! Attention!" And then the commotion really begins as people start to stand up. It's the moment of confusion Dita needs. As she relaxes her arms, the books inside her smock slip down to her lap, but then she grips them against her body again. With each second she holds on to them, her life is more at risk. The SS orders silence. No one is to move from their spot. Disorder irritates the Germans. When they first set in motion the final solution, the bloody executions gave rise to refusals among many of the SS officers. They found it difficult to deal with the mayhem of dead bodies mixed in with those who were still dying. With the arduous task of having to kill again, one by one, those who had already been shot, with a quagmire of blood as they stepped over the fallen bodies, with the hands of the dying coiling around their boots like creeping vines. But this has ceased to be a problem. In Auschwitz, there is no chaos. The killings are routine. The people in front of Dita have stood up and the guards can't see her. She reaches under her smock and grabs hold of the geometry book. As she holds it, she feels the roughness of its pages. She runs a finger over the furrows of the bare spine, and in that moment she shuts her eyes and squeezes the books tightly. She acknowledges what she has known right from the start. She's not going to abandon them. She is the librarian of Block 31. She asked Freddie Hirsch to trust her, almost demanded it, and he did. She won't let him down. Finally, Dita stands up carefully. She holds one arm across her chest, pressing the books to her body. A group of girls obscure her, but she is tall and her posture is suspicious. Before beginning the inspection, the sergeant had given an order and 2 SS guards disappeared under Hirsch's cubicle, where the rest of the books are hidden. Though the hiding place is secure, the books fit in a dugout beneath a wooden floorboard so perfectly as to be undetectable. Dita knows that Hirsch is now in great danger. If they find the books, nothing can save him. Mengele has moved away, but Hirsch continues to stand stock still as the Germans root around his cubicle. 2 SS guards wait outside, relaxed, their heads tilted back. Hirsch remains upright. The more they relax their posture, the more erect he'll be. He'll take any opportunity, no matter how small, to demonstrate the strength of the Jews. They are a stronger people. That is why the Nazis fear them, why they must exterminate them. The Nazis are winning only because the Jews don't have an army of their own, but Hirsch is convinced that the Jews will never make this mistake again. The two SS men came out of the cubicle. The priest holds a few papers in his hand. It seems that this is the only suspicious thing they've found. Mengele gives the papers a cursory look and disdainfully hands them to the sergeant, almost allowing them to fall. They are the reports on the operation of Block 31 that Hirsch writes for the Camp High Command. The priest tucks his hands back into the worn sleeves of his greatcoat. He issues his orders in a low voice, and the guards spring into action. They advance towards the inmates, kicking aside any stools in their path. Fear erupts among the children and the newly arrived teachers, who give way to sobs and cries of anguish. The veterans are less concerned. Hirsch does not move. In a corner, Mengele stands removed, observing. When the pack reaches the first bunch of prisoners, it slows and the guards begin their search. They inspect the prisoners, frisking some, moving their own heads up and down in their search for who knows what. The prisoners pretend to look straight ahead, but they cast sidelong glances at the inmates next to them. The guards order one of the female teachers to step out of the line. She's a tall woman who teaches crafts. In her class, children create small miracles out of old string, wood splinters, broken spoons, and discarded cloth. She doesn't understand what the soldiers are saying. They shout at her and shake her before returning her to the group. There's probably no reason for it. Shouting and shaking are also part of the routine. The guards move on. Dita's arm is getting tired, but she pulls the books into her chest even more tightly. They stop at the group beside hers, and the priest lifts his chin, ordering a man out of the line. It's the first time Dita has paid any attention to Professor Morgenstern, an inoffensive-looking man who, based on the folds of skin under his chin, must once have been chubby. He has close-cropped white hair and wears a faded patched jacket that is too big for him. A pair of round glasses sit in front of his myopic, beaver-like eyes. Dita has difficulty hearing what the priest is saying to him, but she sees Professor Morgenstern hold the spectacles out to him. The priest takes them and examines them. Inmates aren't allowed to keep any personal effects, though glasses for a short-sighted person are no luxury. Even so, the priest examines them carefully before holding them back out for the old man. When the teacher reaches for them, they fall, smashing against a stool before landing on the floor. "Clumsy idiot!" the sergeant yells at him. Professor Morgenstern calmly bends to pick up the broken glasses. He begins to straighten, but a pair of wrinkled origami birds fall from his pocket and he bends again to retrieve them. As he reaches down, his glasses fall to the ground again. The priest observes this clumsiness with barely contained irritation. Angrily, he turns on his heel and continues the inspection. Mengele misses nothing as he watches from the front of the hut. Dita senses the SS approach, though she does not look. They stop in front of her group, the priest directly opposite Dita. Not more than 4 or 5 paces away, she sees the girls trembling. The sweat on her shoulders is icy cold. There's nothing she can do. Her height makes her stick out, and she's the only one not standing to attention, clearly gripping something with one arm. The priest's eye is ruthless and inescapable. He's one of those Nazis who, like Hitler, is intoxicated by hatred. Though she looks straight ahead, Dita feels the priest's gaze piercing her, and fear forms a lump in her throat. She needs air. She's suffocating. She hears a male voice, and she's already preparing herself to step out from the middle of the group. It's all over. But not yet. It's not the voice of the priest, but a much more timid one. It's the voice of Professor Morgenstern. "Excuse me, Sergeant, sir. Do you give me permission to go back to my place in the line? If it's all right with you, of course. Otherwise, I'll stay here until you give me the order. The last thing I want to do is cause you any kind of trouble." The priest looks angrily at the insignificant little man who has dared to address him without permission. The old professor has put his glasses back on, cracked lenses and all, and still standing out of line, he looks dopily toward the SS officer. The priest strides toward him, and the guards follow behind. For the first time he raises his voice. "Stupid old Jewish imbecile. If you're not back in line in 3 seconds, I'll shoot you." "At your service, whatever your order," the professor replies meekly. "I beg you to forgive me. I had no intention of being a nuisance. It's just that I preferred to ask rather than committing an act of insubordination that might be contrary to the rules, because I don't like behaving in an inconvenient manner, and it's my wish to serve you in the most fitting way. Back in line, idiot." "Yes, sir. At your order, sir. Forgive me once again. It wasn't my intention to interrupt, rather. Shut your mouth before I put a bullet in your head, yells the Nazi beside himself. The professor, bowing his head in an exaggerated manner, steps backward, returning to his group. The enraged priest does not notice that his guards are now behind him, and as he turns abruptly, he barrels into them. It's a spectacular scene. Nazis bounce off each other like billiard balls. Some of the children laugh quietly, and the teachers, alarmed, elbow them to be quiet. The sergeant looks to Mengele, who despises nothing more than incompetence, before he angrily thrusts his men aside and resumes the inspection. As he walks in front of Dita's row, she clenches her numb arm and her teeth. In his agitation, the priest thinks he's already inspected this group and moves on to the next. There are more shouts, more shoves, the odd search, and the soldiers move slowly away from Dita. The librarian can breathe again, though the danger has not passed. The guards remain in the hut. Her arm aches from holding it in the same position for so long. To distract herself from the pain, she thinks of how fate brought her to Block 31. It was December when Dita and her family arrived in Auschwitz, and on their very first morning in the camp, before the morning roll call, her mother bumped into an acquaintance from Terezin, Mrs. Chernovska, who had owned a fruit shop in Zlin. The encounter was a small joy amidst the misery. Mrs. Chernovska told Dita's mother of the barrack school for children. There they held roll call under cover, not out of the wet and cold each morning. There they didn't have to work all day. Even the food rations were a little better. When her mother said that Dita was 14, just a year too old to join the school, Mrs. Chernovska told her that the director of the school had convinced the Germans he needed a few assistants to help maintain order in the hut. In this way, he'd taken on a few children aged 14 to 16. Mrs. Chernovska, who seemed to know everything, knew the deputy director, Miriam Edelstein, from her hut. The women found Miriam walking quickly along the Lagerstrasse, the camp's main avenue, which stretched from one end to the other. Miriam was in a rush and in a bad mood. Things hadn't gone at all well for her since her family's transfer from the Terezin ghetto, where her husband, Jacob, had been chairman of the Jewish Council. When they arrived at the camp, he was put with the political prisoners in Auschwitz I. Mrs. Chernovska sang Dita's virtues, but before she could finish, Miriam Edelstein cut her off. "The quota for assistance has been filled, and many people before you have asked me for the same favor." With that, Miriam set off in a great hurry. But just as she was about to disappear down the Lagerstrasse, she stopped, then returned to the spot where she had left the women. They had not moved. "Did you say that this girl speaks perfect Czech and German, and that she reads very well?" In celebration of Hanukkah, the camp was staging a performance of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the prompter, who would remind actors of their lines, had died that morning. And so that afternoon, Dita entered Block 31 for the first time as the new prompter for Snow White. 32 huts, or barracks, formed Camp B2B. They were in 2 rows of 16, lining either side of the Lagerstrasse. Block 31 was the same as those other rectangular barracks, divided by a horizontal brick stove and a chimney, which stood on the foot-flattened dirt floor. But Dita realized that there was one fundamental difference. Instead of rows of triple bunks where the prisoners slept, there were stools and benches. And instead of rotten wood, the walls were covered with drawings of Eskimos and Snow White's dwarfs. Cheerful chaos reigned as volunteers worked to transform the dismal hut into a theater. Some arranged seating, while others transported colorful costumes and cloth decorations. Another group rehearsed lines with the children, and at the far end of the hut the assistants positioned mattresses to form a small stage. Dita was struck by the bustling activity. Against all odds, life stubbornly carried on. They had prepared a small compartment for her at the front of the stage, made out of cardboard and painted black. Rubicek, the director of the play, told Dita to pay particular attention to little Sarah, who forgot to say her lines in German when she became nervous, switching unconsciously to Czech. The Nazis required the performances to be in German. Dita remembers her nerves before the play began, the weight of the responsibility. The audience included some of the top officers of Auschwitz II, Commandant Schwarzhuber and Dr. Mengele. Whenever she glanced through a hole in her cardboard box, she was astonished to see how much they laughed and clapped. Could these be the same people who sent thousands and thousands of children to their death each day? Of all the plays performed in Block 31, The December 1943 version of Snow White was one of the most memorable. When the performance started, the magic mirror stuttered at the wicked stepmother. You are the most beautiful, my queen. The audience erupted in laughter, thinking it a joke, but Dita was sweating inside her cardboard shell. The stammering wasn't in the script. When Snow White was abandoned in the forest, the guffaws stopped. The part was played by a young girl with an air of sadness. She looked fragile as she wandered, lost, pleading for help in her tiny voice, and Dita felt a knot in her chest. She too was lost, surrounded by wolves. Little Snow White began to sing, and the audience went completely silent. It was only then the prince, the broad-shouldered Freddie Hirsch, came to her rescue, that the audience came to life again, applauding their approval. The play ended with a huge ovation. Even the impassive Dr. Mengele applauded, though he didn't remove his white gloves, of course. It is this same Dr. Mengele who now stands at the end of Block 31, taking in the scene. The priest leads his guards toward the back of the hut, kicking aside stools and hauling inmates out of the line, though they find no excuse to take inmates away. Not this time. When the Nazis finish inspecting the hut, the sergeant turns to the medical captain, but he has vanished. The guards should be pleased. They have found no escape tunnels or weapons, nothing against the rules, but they are furious. There is nothing to punish. They shout and make threats, violently shaking one boy, and then they leave. They've gone, but they'll be back. When the door shuts behind them, there's a murmur of relief. Freddie Hirsch puts the whistle he always wears around his neck to his lips and blows it loudly, signaling them to fall out. Dita's arm is so numb she can barely move it, and the pain brings tears to her eyes. She is so relieved by the departure of the Nazis that she cries and laughs at the same time. Nervous chatter breaks out. The teachers want to discuss what has happened, to understand what they have seen. The children run around and let off steam. Dita sees Mrs. Kriskova approach her, bearing down on her. As she walks, the flap of skin under her chin wobbles like a turkey's gobbler. She stops just in front of Dita. "Are you crazy, girl? Don't you know that when the order is given, you have to go to your assigned spot in the assistance area, not run around like a madwoman? Don't you realize that they can haul you off and kill you? Don't you realize that they can kill all of us?" "I did what I thought best." "What you thought," begins Mrs. Kriskova, her face wrinkling. "And who are you to change the rules? Do you think you know everything?" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Kriskova." Dita clenches her fist to stop her tears from falling. She's not going to give her the satisfaction. "I'm going to report what you've done." "That won't be necessary," says a man's voice, speaking Czech with a strong German accent, slow and deliberate, and yet emphatic. It is Hirsch. "Mrs. Kriskova, there's still a little time before class ends. You should take charge of your group." Mrs. Kriskova always brags that she has the most disciplined and hard-working group of girls in all of Block 31. Without a word, she glances furiously at the head of the hut, turns around, and marches stiffly away toward her pupils. Dita sighs with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Hirsch." "Freddie." "I'm sorry I broke the rules." Hirsch smiles at her. A good soldier doesn't need to wait for orders. He knows what his duty is. And before he walks off, he turns toward her and looks at the book she's holding against her chest. "I'm proud of you, Dita. May God bless you." She watches him leave and remembers the night of the Snow White performance. As the assistants were dismantling the stage, Dita emerged from her prompter's den and headed for the exit, thinking she might never again set foot in this wonderful hut that could turn itself into a theater. But a vaguely familiar voice stopped her. "Young girl." Freddie Hirsch's face was still covered with white chalk makeup. "Your arrival in this camp is timely," he said. "Timely?" "Absolutely." He gestured for her to follow him to the back of the stage, which was now empty of people. Close up, Hirsch's eyes were an odd mix of gentleness and insolence. "I desperately need a librarian for our children's hut." It astonished Dita that he would remember her. Hirsch had been in charge of the youth office in the Terezin ghetto, but she'd caught a glimpse of him only a few times as she helped one of the librarians wheel her trolley of books. Dita was perplexed, though. She was no librarian. She was just a 14-year-old girl. "Forgive me, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. The librarian is Miss Sidigova. I only helped her." The director of Block 31 smiled. "I noticed you several times. You were pushing the library cart." "Yes, because it was very heavy for her, and the little wheels didn't roll easily on the cobblestones." "You could have spent the afternoon lying on your pallet." going for walks with your girlfriends, or just doing your own thing, but instead you pushed the cart so that people could have their books." She was looking at him, perplexed, but Hirsch's words left no room for argument. He was in charge of an army, and like a general he pronounced, "You are a librarian." He added, "But it's dangerous, very dangerous. Handling books here is no game. If the SS catches anyone with a book, they execute them." As he said it, he raised his thumb and extended his index finger. He aimed that imaginary pistol at Dita's forehead. She tried to appear unbothered, but she was becoming nervous at the thought of this responsibility. "Count on me. It's a huge risk. I don't mind at all. They might kill you. I don't mind." Dita tried to sound decisive, but she was unsuccessful. She could not control her trembling legs, and Hirsch stared at her shaking limbs. Running the library requires a brave person. Dita blushed. The more she tried to stay still, the wilder her trembling became. Her hands began to shake too, and she feared the director might think her too weak for the job. So you're not counting on me, then?" "You seem like a brave girl to me." "But I'm trembling," she replied, devastated. Then Hirsch smiled in his particular way. "That's why you're brave. Brave people are not the ones who aren't afraid. Those are reckless people who ignore the risk. They put themselves and others in danger. That's not the sort of person I want on my team. I need the ones who know the risk, whose legs shake, but who carry on." As she listened, Dita's legs began to tremble less. "Brave people are the ones who can overcome their own fear. You are one of those. What's your name?" "My name is Edita Adler, Mr. Hirsch." "Welcome to Block 31, Edita. May God bless you. Please call me Freddie." They had waited quietly until everyone had gone. Then Dita entered Freddie Hirsch's cubicle, a narrow rectangle with a pallet and a pair of old chairs. It was almost bare, with only a few food packages, scraps of material left over from the set of Snow White, and Freddie's food bowl in sight. Hirsch told her something that left her dumbstruck. They had a library on legs, a living library. Teachers who knew particular books well had become book people. They rotated among the different groups, telling the children stories they knew almost by heart. Mrs. Magda is really good with the wonderful adventures of Nils Holgersson, and the children have fun when she makes them imagine that they're flying over the skies of Sweden holding on to geese. Sasek does a really good job with the stories of the American Indians and the adventures of the Wild West. Dazo Kovac is almost like a walking Bible. But this living library wasn't enough for Freddie Hirsch. He told her about the books that had reached the camp clandestinely. A Polish carpenter called Mietek had brought 3, and a Slavic electrician another 2. They were the sorts of prisoners who moved among the camps with greater freedom, as they were employed to do maintenance work. They had managed to sneak some books from the ramp from where the luggage from the arriving transports was sorted by privileged prisoners. As the librarian, Dita would be in charge of keeping track of which books were lent to each teacher, as well as collecting the books when classes were finished and returning them to their secret compartment. Hirsch made for a corner where scraps of material were piled up and moved them aside. He removed a wooden board, and books began to emerge. Dita couldn't restrain her joy and clapped. "This is your library. It's not much." And he looked at her out of the corner of his eye to see what effect it was having on her. It wasn't an extensive library. In fact, it consisted of 8 books, and some of them were in poor condition. But they were books. In this incredibly dark place, they were a reminder of less somber times when words rang out more loudly than machine guns. Dita picked up the books one by one, holding them in her hands as carefully as she would a newborn baby. The first one was an unbound atlas with a few pages missing. It showed a Europe of the past, with empires that had ceased to exist some time ago. The political maps were a mosaic of vermilion, brilliant greens, orange, navy blue, in sharp contrast to the dullness that surrounded Dita, the dark brown of the mud, the faded ochre of the huts, and an ashy, clouded sky. She started to leaf through the pages, and it was as if she were flying over the world. She crossed oceans and mountains, navigating with her finger along the rivers Danube and Volga, and then the Nile. And to put all those millions of square kilometers of seas, forests, all the earth's mountain ranges, all the rivers, all the cities and countries into such a tiny space was a miracle that only a book could achieve. Freddie Hirsch watched her in silence, taking pleasure in her absorbed expression. If he had any doubts about the responsibility he'd given to the young Czech girl, they dissipated in that moment. He knew that Edita would look after the library carefully. The basic treatise on geometry was somewhat better preserved. It unfurled a different geography in its pages. A countryside of isosceles triangles, octagons, and cylinders, rows of ordered numbers and squads of arithmetical armies, formations that were like clouds, parallelograms like mysterious cells. Her eyes opened wide at the third book. It was A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells, a book populated by primitive men, Egyptians, Romans, Maya, civilizations that formed empires and then collapsed so that new ones could emerge. The fourth title was A Russian Grammar. She didn't understand a thing, but she liked those enigmatic letters. Now that Germany was also at war with Russia, the Russians were her friends. Dita had heard that there were many Russian prisoners of war in Auschwitz, and that the Nazis treated them with extreme cruelty. There was also a French novel in bad condition and a treatise with the title New Paths of Psychoanalytic Therapy by a professor named Freud. There was another novel in Russian with no cover, and the eighth book was Czech, only a handful of sheets held together with a few threads along the spine. Before she could take it in her hands, Freddie grabbed it. She looked at him with the expression of a displeased librarian. She wished she had a pair of tortoise-shell glasses so that she could look at him over their rim as serious librarians do. This one's in a very bad state. It's no good. I'll fix it. And anyway, it's not appropriate for children, especially girls. Dita narrowed her eyes in irritation. With all due respect, Freddie, I'm 14 years old. Do you honestly believe that after observing on a daily basis thousands